She was 64. He was 27. A love story shattered by betrayal. But what happens when everything you believed in is ripped away and you have to choose between heartbreak and freedom? This is a journey of unexpected strength, painful realizations, and a decision that will change everything. Stay with me to find out how it all unfolds. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the smell of burnt toast in the air. The sun was just starting to dip below the horizon, casting a pale orange glow through the window. I glanced at the clock. It was almost 6 p.m. I should have been used to the quiet by now. But something felt different tonight. My husband, Richard, had been acting strange for the past few weeks. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I noticed how his eyes would wander whenever we were together. How his phone would buzz, and he'd quickly pick it up and hide it in his lap. He was 27 years younger than me. We had a good life together, or so I thought. But recently, the cracks had begun to show. I had always told myself age didn't matter. But as the days passed, I started feeling the weight of it. The way he looked at me as if he was counting the years, the miles between us. I stood up to check on dinner, the sound of my slippers sliding across the kitchen floor breaking the silence. My mind was racing, but I tried to focus on the task at hand. The sizzling sound of the pan didn't help calm my nerves. Then I heard the sound of the front door creaking open. I froze. Richard was home. I could hear his footsteps on the wooden floor. But they were off. Too quick. Too light. He wasn't walking with the usual heaviness of his tired feet. My heart skipped a beat. I turned slowly, holding my breath. He stood there, in the doorway, his face flushed. But it wasn't just the rush of evening air. It was something else. Something unfamiliar. Behind him, a figure emerged. A woman. I could barely make out her features, but her presence was unmistakable. The blood drained from my face. I felt my knees wobble. Richard looked at me, his eyes wide, startled. But there was no apology. No shame. Just silence. The woman stepped forward, her high heels clicking sharply on the floor. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words stuck in my throat. My mind raced. I wanted to scream, to ask him what this meant. But I couldn't. The room felt smaller, hotter. I could barely breathe. And in that moment, everything I had built, everything I had known shattered. The woman stood there, her gaze fixed on me. I didn't know if I should look at her or at Richard. He stood motionless, as if waiting for me to speak. But my mouth was dry. My legs felt weak. The silence stretched on, unbearable. I tried to focus on anything but the sting in my chest. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with tension. I finally found my voice, but it trembled, barely a whisper. "What is this?" Richard didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked to the woman, then back to me, and then he sighed. I didn't mean for it to happen this way. The words didn't make sense. I couldn't comprehend them. What did he mean? He didn't mean for it to happen. My heart hammered in my chest. I felt like I was watching a scene from someone else's life. Someone I didn't recognize. The woman shifted slightly, her eyes scanning me, not with sympathy, but with something else. I couldn't look at her any longer. I had to focus on Richard. But his expression was unreadable. It wasn't guilt, not even regret. It was almost like he expected me to accept it. Like he was waiting for me to nod, to understand. I couldn't. I didn't. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice strained. It didn't sound like an apology, though. It felt rehearsed, like he was reading from a script. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of the image in front of me. The woman looked so young. She could have been his sister. I couldn't fathom how she fit into our lives, into my life. She stepped closer, but I took a step back, my pulse pounding in my ears. I had to get out of the room. I turned and walked toward the back door, my fingers gripping the doorknob as I opened it, escaping into the cool evening air. The breeze hit my face, sharp and cold, but it did nothing to soothe the burning in my chest. My breath came in shallow bursts, my hands trembling. I couldn't believe what I had just seen. Richard was inside, probably talking to her, explaining. Or maybe not. I didn't want to know. I needed to be away from it, away from them. The world felt unreal, distorted. The weight of it was too much. I walked aimlessly down the driveway, the gravel crunching beneath my feet. The stars were just starting to twinkle in the sky, as if mocking me. Everything felt distant, like I was walking through a dream I couldn't wake up from. A nightmare I couldn't escape. I walked for what felt like hours, my mind spinning, my feet carrying me without thought. The cold air bit at my skin, but I barely noticed. All I could hear was the pounding of my heart. What had I done wrong? What had I missed? The questions clawed at me, each one sharper than the last. I paused for a moment, standing on the side of the road, staring into the dark. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, crooked shadows. I had spent my whole life believing in love, in loyalty, in the idea that things would always be okay if we worked for them. But now, nothing made sense. I didn't understand how Richard could do this to me. We had been together for so long. I had given him everything. And now here I was, alone in the dark. The weight of betrayal settled on my shoulders, heavy and suffocating. I heard the sound of a car approaching, its headlights cutting through the night. I flinched, instinctively stepping back. But the car didn't slow down. It drove past me, the engine's roar fading into the distance. I felt numb. I had been married for so many years, I never imagined something like this could happen. Richard had always been my rock, my constant. But now I didn't recognize him. And I certainly didn't recognize the woman he had brought into our home. I stood there for a long time, not knowing what to do, not knowing where to go. The world seemed to move on without me. I was stuck in place, as if everything had frozen around me, except for the pain. I eventually turned and walked back home, each step heavier than the last. The house looked different now. The front door was still open, a small crack letting the light spill out into the yard. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what I should do next. Should I confront him? Should I leave? My hands were shaking as I reached for the door. I pushed it open, the familiar creak of the hinges sounding more like a warning than an invitation. The house felt cold, the air thick with tension. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the room for them. Richard was standing by the kitchen, his back to me. The woman was gone. But the silence remained. I could feel it pressing in, suffocating. It was the silence of something broken. Richard turned to face me, his expression unreadable. Are you okay? His voice was soft, almost too soft, as if he was unsure of how to approach me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something, to break everything in sight. But all I could do was nod, my throat too tight to speak. I never meant for it to happen, he said again. His words felt empty now. I couldn't look at him. I couldn't trust him. The pain was too raw, too fresh. Every part of me wanted to leave, to walk away and never look back. But something kept me rooted to the spot. I had to know the truth. I had to hear him say it. Who is she? My voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. Richard hesitated, his eyes darting to the floor. She's someone I met. I could see the discomfort in his face. But there was no regret, no apology. I had always believed him when he told me I was the one. But now I wasn't so sure. I took a step back, my legs shaking. It felt like the world was crumbling around me. I needed to escape again. But this time, there was nowhere to run. I stood there, rooted to the floor, as the truth settled around me like a thick fog. His words echoed in my ears, but they didn't make sense. Someone I met. I couldn't understand how we had gone from years of shared memories, love, and promises to this. His face remained unreadable, cold even. The space between us felt infinite now, as if everything that had once connected us had been erased. I wanted to scream.
To ask why.
Why her? Why now? But the words wouldn't come. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but all I could taste was the bitter sting of betrayal. I didn't know if I should leave, or if I should demand answers. My chest tightened with the weight of what I had seen, what I had learned. I turned slowly, my mind racing, trying to find some semblance of clarity in the chaos. I need to go for a walk, I said, the words barely forming, escaping in a hoarse whisper. I didn't wait for his response. I couldn't. I walked to the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. I stepped outside, the cool night air hitting my face like a slap. It did nothing to numb the ache inside. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I just needed to get away from him, from the house, from everything. The street was empty, the only sound the rustle of leaves in the wind. I wandered through the quiet neighborhood, not paying attention to where my feet carried me. My mind was consumed by the image of her smile, her confidence, the way Richard looked at her like she was something new, something exciting. I had always feared something like this, but now that it was happening, it felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. I passed by the park, the swings creaking in the wind. It was so peaceful here, so still. But inside, I was a storm. The woman's face kept flashing in my mind. Her youth, her vitality, so different from mine. I was 64 years old. What did I have to offer anymore? The question hung in the air, unanswered. I felt the sting of it deep in my bones. My hands were trembling, my mind whirling with confusion and hurt. I sat down on a bench by the park, the cold metal biting through my jacket. The tears threatened to come, but I refused to let them fall. I didn't want to cry. Not now. Not in front of him. But I couldn't stop the aching inside me, the emptiness that seemed to swallow everything whole. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to gather the fragments of myself that were slipping away. I needed to make a decision. I had to choose, one way or another. Stay and try to fix this, or walk away and never look back. But in the silence of the park, with only the faint sound of the wind around me, the answer was clear. I had already made my choice. I just wasn't sure I was strong enough to face it. I stayed on that bench for what felt like hours, but the time seemed irrelevant. The world around me moved on, indifferent to my pain. The night deepened, the air growing colder, but I remained motionless, lost in thought. I knew I couldn't stay in that house, not with him, not after what had happened. But leaving wasn't as simple as walking away. There was so much history there, so many moments of laughter, of comfort. But now, all of it felt like a lie. My mind kept flashing back to that first moment I had seen her, standing in the doorway, her smile as confident as if she belonged there. She didn't belong in our life. She didn't belong in my life. I ran my hands through my hair, frustrated. The tears I had fought off earlier were now clawing at my chest. They burned, a quiet ache that gnawed at me. But I refused to let them fall. Not yet. Not until I understood what I needed to do. Finally, I stood up from the bench. The decision felt heavier now, more real. I had to go back. I had to confront him. With each step I took toward home, my heart pounded in my chest, a drumbeat of dread. I knew the conversation wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. For both of us. For me. When I reached the house, the front door was still slightly ajar, like an invitation to face what I couldn't escape. I took a deep breath before walking inside, the familiar creak of the door announcing my return. Richard was sitting on the couch, his head in his hands. He looked up when I entered, his face pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and something else I couldn't quite place. His words came slowly, like he was trying to find a way to make it sound less like a betrayal. I never wanted to hurt you, Carol. I don't know what happened, it just did. It's complicated. Don't. I interrupted, my voice firm. I don't need your excuses. You made a choice, Richard. And I'm not sure I can ever forgive you for that. He flinched, the words stinging more than I think he expected. But I couldn't stop. I had to say it, to put it all out in the open. I gave you everything, and you threw it all away. For what? Because she's young? Because she's exciting? I took a step closer to him, the pain making my voice crack. Do you think I don't see that? Do you think I don't know what I've become to you? Richard stood up, his face contorting with emotion.
No.
It's not like that. Stop lying, I snapped. Just stop. I've spent my life loving you, trusting you. And you couldn't even have the decency to be honest with me. I saw the way you looked at her. I saw everything. There was silence between us, thick and suffocating. Richard's eyes darted around the room, but he couldn't meet my gaze. The tears were finally coming now, but I didn't try to stop them. They slid down my face, warm against the coldness that had settled inside me. I'm done, I whispered, more to myself than to him. I can't do this anymore. Richard's face crumpled. Please, please don't leave. I don't want to lose you. But the words rang hollow. His voice, once a source of comfort, now felt like a reminder of everything I had lost. I turned away from him, my chest tight, my heart breaking with every step I took toward the door. I could hear him calling my name, but I didn't look back. The house felt smaller now, suffocating, as if the walls were closing in around me. I stepped outside into the night again, the cold air hitting me like a slap. But this time, it didn't feel as sharp. It felt like a goodbye, a finality. I wasn't sure where I was going, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was walking towards something that was mine. And that thought, no matter how small, gave me the strength to keep moving forward. I walked aimlessly through the empty streets, the darkness wrapping around me like a thick blanket. The chill in the air was biting, but it didn't matter. My mind was elsewhere, swirling with the weight of everything I had just left behind. Each step felt both heavy and freeing at the same time. I had just turned my back on everything I thought I knew, everything I had built. But there was no going back now. I couldn't. I didn't want to. The memory of Richard's face, the pain in his eyes as I walked away, lingered in my mind. But it didn't stop me. I couldn't allow myself to be consumed by it. I passed the park again, the swings swaying gently in the wind. I stopped for a moment, staring at the emptiness, feeling like an outsider in my own life. I had always been the one who gave, who held everything together. And now it felt like I was falling apart. I pulled my coat tighter around me, trying to ward off the biting cold, but it didn't help. The chill had settled deep in my bones. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the loss, the betrayal. I walked past familiar houses, each one a reminder of everything I was leaving behind. The neighborhood, the comfort, the safety. But none of it mattered anymore. I couldn't stay there. I had to find somewhere, anywhere, where I could breathe again. The streets began to look unfamiliar, the houses darker, more distant. I hadn't intended to walk this far, but my feet kept moving, my mind unable to find peace. After a while, I found myself standing outside a small cafe, its warm glow spilling out onto the sidewalk. Without thinking, I pushed the door open and stepped inside, the warmth wrapping around me like a blanket. The cafe was quiet, save for the low hum of conversation and the clink of coffee cups. I sat down at a table by the window, pulling off my coat and draping it over the back of a chair. The barista glanced over, a friendly smile on his face as he approached. "What can I get for you?" he asked, his voice soft, almost as if he could sense the storm inside me. I looked up at him, momentarily lost, before forcing a small smile. "Just a coffee. Black, please." He nodded and disappeared behind the counter. I took a deep breath, trying to center myself. The warmth of the cafe felt like a sharp contrast to the cold emptiness inside me. I wrapped my hands around the mug when it was placed in front of me, the heat comforting against my skin. The cafe's soft music played in the background, but I couldn't focus on anything except the echo of Richard's voice, the feeling of his absence pressing down on me. What now? What was I supposed to do with myself? I had spent my whole life building a future with him, with us. And now I had nothing. A wave of loneliness washed over me, a suffocating tide. I had left the life I knew, and for the first time, I realized just how alone I really was. The truth hit me then, with the force of a freight train. I wasn't just leaving Richard. I was leaving me. The woman who had stayed silent for so long, the one who had believed in the promises, in the love. Who was I now without all of that? The tears finally came, this time with no fight left in me. They blurred my vision, but I didn't care. I didn't need to be strong anymore. Not for him. Not for anyone. The barista returned to check on me, his eyes soft with unspoken understanding, but I didn't want company. I needed silence. I needed to figure out who I was again, in this world where everything had changed. I stood up, my hands trembling, and left the cafe without another word. The night was still as I stepped back into the cold. The cities hummed distant and far away. I had no idea what the future would hold. But for the first time, I felt like I might be ready to face it. Alone, but not lost. The cold air hit me again as I walked back into the night, but it wasn't as sharp as before. I welcomed it now, the sting a reminder that I was still alive, still breathing, still moving forward. I didn't know where I was headed, but that didn't matter. For the first time, the direction seemed irrelevant. It was the act of moving, of leaving that felt important. I needed to move past the weight of everything, past the suffocating memories of Richard and the life we had built. I walked through streets I didn't recognize, the lights overhead casting long shadows on the pavement. Everything felt strange, unfamiliar, like a world I had never known. But at the same time, it felt liberating. The silence wrapped around me again, but it was a different kind of silence now, one that wasn't filled with the hum of pain and regret. It was a silence that allowed me to think, to breathe, without the weight of expectations or promises. I stopped at a small park, the swing set creaking softly in the breeze, and sat on a bench beneath the dim glow of a nearby streetlight. I let my mind wander, letting go of the thoughts that had been consuming me for so long. Who was I now? What was I supposed to do with this freedom, with this space that had suddenly opened up before me? I thought about Richard for a moment, the man I had spent so many years with, the man I had loved more than anything. But as the memory of his face flashed in my mind, it no longer felt like our story. It felt like a story I had watched from the outside, like I was a stranger to my own life. I had been someone else, someone who had stayed in a place of comfort, even when that comfort had turned into a prison. But I wasn't that person anymore. I wasn't the woman who would silently accept betrayal. I wasn't the woman who would remain silent, waiting for things to get better. I was me, the woman who could stand up for herself, the woman who could leave. A fresh wind picked up, blowing through the trees and rustling the leaves, a soft reminder that life continued, whether I was ready or not. And as I sat there in the quiet of the night, something inside me shifted. I didn't have to figure everything out tonight. I didn't have to have all the answers. But I was no longer bound to a life I didn't choose. And that realization brought a strange sense of peace. For the first time in a long while, I could see the possibility of a future, even if it was uncertain, even if it was filled with questions. I stood up from the bench and took a deep breath, looking up at the stars. They were far away, but they were always there, steady, unchanging. I could be that way too. I didn't need Richard. I didn't need anyone to define me anymore. I was starting over. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what I needed. I walked back down the path, my steps lighter now, as the future, uncertain but mine, stretched out ahead of me. The weeks passed in a blur of quiet change. I spent most of my time focusing on things that had nothing to do with Richard, nothing to do with the past. I wasn't running away, I was rebuilding. I started to rediscover parts of myself I had forgotten existed. I took up painting again, something I hadn't done in years. The strokes of color on the canvas felt like a kind of therapy, each brushstroke pushing the pain out a little more. I started walking more, letting the world around me wash over me, people, the seasons, the noise, the calm. I learned to enjoy the small, simple moments. But in the back of my mind, Richard never fully left. I had told myself that I had made my choice, that I was done. But the memories kept creeping in, quiet and persistent. The life we had shared together wasn't something I could simply erase, no matter how hard I tried. There were moments when I would find myself alone in the quiet of my apartment, and the weight of everything, the loneliness, the anger, the betrayal, would hit me all over again. I missed the idea of love. Not just the love with Richard, but the love I had always believed in. The kind that didn't break, the kind that didn't shatter like glass at the first sign of pressure. But I wasn't the same woman anymore. One evening, as I sat with a cup of tea, staring out the window at the soft glow of the streetlights, I received a message. It was from Richard.
Can we talk?
My heart skipped a beat. The same questions from that night, the ones I had pushed away, flooded my mind again. Should I respond? Should I listen? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I let the silence hang in the air, giving myself a moment to reflect. Then, with a deep breath, I replied, I think we've both said everything we needed to say. I set the phone down and looked out the window again. The answer felt final, but it also felt like something was closing. A door I couldn't open again, no matter how much I wanted to. I had made my peace. With him. With myself. And that was enough. The night felt different now. It wasn't just the end of something. It was the beginning of something new. Months passed, and the sting of the past began to fade, replaced by something softer, something more certain. I didn't think about Richard as much anymore. His name didn't carry the same weight it once did. Life had quietly moved on, and so had I. I spent my days in small, unremarkable ways that felt big to me, attending art classes, meeting friends for coffee, reading books I had put off for too long. I learned that my own company could be enough. I didn't need someone to define me. I didn't need validation. I had spent so many years wrapped up in someone else's love, someone else's life, that I had forgotten how to live for myself. But now, I was rediscovering what it meant to be me. The person I had always been under all the layers, under all the years of self-doubt and compromise. One afternoon, I found myself at the same cafe where I had sat all those months ago, the one where I had gone to hide, to breathe after everything had exploded in my life. It was quiet again, the familiar hum of conversations and clinking cups in the background. I sat at a table by the window, the sunlight pouring in, casting soft shadows across the floor. It was almost surreal, this sense of peace. As I looked out at the world, I realized that I wasn't the same woman who had left Richard. I had grown. I had changed. And for the first time in years, I was proud of who I had become. The phone buzzed on the table, pulling me from my thoughts. It was a message from my daughter, a simple "How are you?" followed by a string of smiley faces. I smiled, my heart warm. I realized that, despite everything, there was so much love in my life still. The kind that didn't need to be proven or earned. I put the phone down and leaned back in my chair, taking a deep breath. The world was vast, and my place in it was mine alone to discover. The past was behind me, and the future, whatever it held, was a journey I was ready to face, one step at a time. And in that moment, I was content. I was free. Finally, I was whole again.